The Day the Fat Fighter Refused to Die, June 26, 1943, off the French coast near Forges-les-Eaux. The channel is a dull grey strip far below, and at 26,000 feet, the canopy of Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson's Republic P-47C is rimmed with frost where his breath hits the cold plexiglass. The Thunderbolt feels less like a fighter and more like a locomotive with wings, big radial nose out front, thick fuselage behind him, and that steady, brutal thrum of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double wasp pulling hard as the formation rides the thin air. Ahead, the sky is crowded with weary B-17 limping home from Villacoublay, their contrails ragged, their gunners still scanning because the enemy likes to hit a bomber when it's already bleeding. Johnson can feel the weight of the aircraft in every small correction. This is not a Spitfire that flicks and dances, and the Luftwaffe knows it too. German pilots have been calling the P-47 a flying bathtub, too fat to turn, too bulky to be a real threat. And the joke spreads because it sounds like truth when you see the Jug lumbering at escort speed beside sleek bombers. Inside Johnson's cockpit, though, there is nothing funny. Oxygen hisses, the radio crackles with clipped call signs, and the altimeter needle sits high enough that his fingers feel stiff even in gloves. He keeps glancing at engine instruments because the Thunderbolt's power is its promise and its risk. And every man in these early months knows the aircraft is still being learned, still being tamed. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, has already decided the Jug must be flown like a hammer, not a rapier. But today, the fight comes in the worst way, from above and behind, where mockery turns into muzzle flashes. A shout cracks in the headset, "Bandits!" High 6. And in the next heartbeat, the sky erupts with fast, slashing shapes. Focke-Wulf FW-190S diving with that confident, predatory angle German veterans have perfected, their cannons and machine guns spitting. Johnson sees one pass through the formation like a thrown knife, and then the world detonates around him as impacts slam into the Thunderbolt's fuselage with a sound like someone beating a steel drum with an axe. The canopy splinters. Ice-cold air knifes in, bright fragments whirl past his eyes. Something punches his leg, a hot bite, and the Jug lurches as if a giant hand has grabbed the tail. Warning lights flicker, then settle into a sick, steady glow. Hydraulics gone, pressure bleeding away, and in that same instant the Thunderbolt begins to fall. Not a controlled dive, but a sickening, spiraling drop as the controls go heavy and the horizon rolls. Your body knows what that means before your mind can name it. A fighter out of formation, wounded, alone, exactly what the Luftwaffe hunts. Johnson's gloves are slick with sweat inside the cold, and he forces himself to do the only thing he can: kick rudder, fight the spin, keep the wings from fully locking into the spiral. The P-47 shakes, the airframe groans, the engine roars and then steadies again, still running, still dragging him through the sky as if refusing to admit defeat. He catches a glimpse of the bomber stream far away and realizes he's separated. A single fat American fighter under a sky full of German claws. Another FW-190 flashes by, close enough that Johnson sees the dark cross, the pilot's helmeted head, and then the next burst arrives. More hammering. More holes punched into metal that should not survive. The Jug answers not with elegance, but with endurance. It keeps flying. Johnson levels out low enough that the air is thicker, the controls respond a fraction more, and the sea appears as a distant promise, the direction of home. Yet the enemy stays with him, circling, making passes that should finish a wounded plane. He tries to bring the Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber Browning guns to bear, but every time he starts a turn, the aircraft feels like it's dragging a weight through wet sand, and he knows that if he commits too hard, he'll stall or lose what little control he has left. The German pilot, one of JG-26's men, skilled and close, keeps coming, pouring fire into the battered American machine, and the P-47 absorbs it with a kind of stubborn cruelty. Bullets bite into wings, tail, fuselage. Holes appear in the propeller blades. Armor plate rings behind the cockpit as cannon shells strike near Johnson's head. So close he can feel the shock through the seat. The cockpit fills with the metallic smell of torn aluminum and cordite, and the wind howls through the shattered canopy, trying to rip maps and checklists out of the cramped space. Johnson's mind narrows to a single, ugly goal. Keep the engine running, keep the wings level, keep moving west. The Thunderbolt's secret is not just its guns or its speed in a dive, but the fact that the aircraft was built around that huge radial engine and a rugged airframe meant to survive punishment. And in this moment, you can feel what that design philosophy really means. It means the plane can be a sieve and still stay in the air. It means self-sealing tanks and armor and redundant structure doing their quiet work, while a man fights for minutes that feel like hours. The FW-190 makes another pass, then another, and somehow the jug is still there, still refusing. Johnson thinks absurdly of the German jokes, the fat fighter, the ugly brute, and wants to laugh. But all he can do is keep flying while his leg throbs and his nose stings from a graze and his hands ache from gripping the stick too hard. At last, the attacks slacken, not because the threat is gone, but because the enemy's window is closing and fuel and ammunition are not infinite. And the German fighter drifts alongside for a heartbeat, close. Enough to see, then peels away. Johnson doesn't watch it go for long because the channel is still ahead, and his aircraft is still wounded, and he still has to land, and landing a P-47 with damaged systems is its own kind of combat. As the English coast finally rises out of haze, he reaches for the gear lever out of instinct, then remembers the dead hydraulics, and his stomach knots with a new fear. He might survive the fight only to die on the runway. The jug keeps answering him in the only language it knows. Heavy, stubborn motion. A battered machine dragging its pilot home, full of holes that should have been fatal. And as Johnson lines up with an airfield back in Britain, you realize the mockery is already dying in the sky behind him, because no one laughs at a fighter that comes home like this and still lands. The moment Johnson's Thunderbolt crosses the English coastline, it's no longer a fight in the sky. It's a fight against physics and pain, a crippled machine trying to become an airplane again long enough to touch the earth. And as he slides in toward the field with dead hydraulics and a canopy that won't close, he can feel every vibration through the seat, as if the P-47 is arguing with the runway. He keeps the jug fast. Too fast feels dangerous, too slow feels fatal. Nursing the big radial and working the rudder pedals like a man rowing through surf, because the aircraft is heavy even when it's healthy, and today it's wounded and stubborn. The wheels finally come down by emergency procedure, and the landing is ugly. A hard slap and a long skittering roll, the kind that makes ground crews flinch because they can see the airplane is coming in looking wrong. And when it stops, men sprint toward it, expecting fire, expecting the sudden bloom of gasoline, expecting a cockpit full of smoke. Instead, what they find is something stranger. A Thunderbolt that has returned from France, looking like it has been fed through a shredder and decided to come home anyway. Jagged tears where 20mm shells tore metal open, the fuselage peppered, wings dimpled and punctured, tail surfaces riddled, and even the propeller blades bitten through by rounds that should have shattered them. Johnson sits still for a moment because his body is catching up, because his leg is burning where shrapnel went in, and his face stings where a bullet grazed the tip of his nose, and because the canopy is jammed so tight from damage that he can't simply climb out like a triumphant ace. The ground crew, his crew chief among them, climbs onto the wing, shouting questions over the ticking, cooling engine. And when Johnson finally tries to stand, he realizes he's half trapped by his own airplane, a man locked inside a battered cockpit that smells of cordite and cold wind and hot oil. They work tools into seams, pry at the warped frame, and when the canopy finally gives, it does so with a reluctant metallic groan, as if the jug is protesting being opened after it has carried its pilot across the channel with sheer refusal. On the tarmac, Johnson tries to do what fighter pilots always do after they survive. Turn it into numbers, make the chaos measurable, and he starts counting holes in the skin, counting punctures and tears as if a tally could explain how he is still breathing. He gets past 100 without moving his feet, keeps counting, then realizes the whole airplane is a map of impacts, every square foot seemingly perforated, and he gives up after the count passes 200 because the arithmetic has become meaningless. Someone points to the armor plate behind the cockpit where three 20mm shells have hammered and burst so near his headrest that the metal is twisted, the kind of evidence that makes even experienced mechanics swallow hard. Because this isn't just battle damage, it's a thin margin between a story and a grave. A medical orderly insists on his leg, and Johnson's stubbornness breaks only when the pain finally demands attention. And as they help him away, the idea that had been floating around Luftwaffe briefings, that the P-47 is too fat, too clumsy, too easy, quietly starts to rot, because here is the answer sitting on concrete. The fat fighter that should have been dead over France is parked safely in England. In the intelligence room, the story comes out in clipped fragments. Jumped near Forges-les-Eaux, FW-190S diving from above and behind, the first pass scattering the formation, Johnson's jug taking a brutal concentration of cannon fire, 21 20mm hits rupturing hydraulics, followed by hundreds of 7.92mm rounds that stitch the airframe wingtip to wingtip. He describes the moment the Germans slid alongside at the end, rocking wings in a salute before turning away, an eerie gesture that feels less like sportsmanship than disbelief, like a predator backing off from prey that refuses to die. And somewhere inside those reports, amid the bearings and altitudes and mission targets, sits the real lesson the war is teaching in 1943. Survivability is a weapon. The Thunderbolt was built around the R2800 and a rugged structure that could absorb punishment, with armor where it mattered and self-sealing fuel tanks tucked beneath the cockpit. And that design turns damage that would kill other fighters into damage you can limp home with, which means a pilot lives to fly again and the squadron keeps its experienced men. You can feel that lesson spreading through the 56th Fighter Group, not as a slogan, but as a change in behavior. Pilots lean into the jug's strengths, stop trying to dogfight like Spitfires, and instead fight like Zemka teaches: high, fast, diving attacks, zoom climbs, disciplined gunnery, letting 8.50 caliber guns do their blunt work, and letting the airplane's speed in a dive and sheer toughness keep them alive. The Luftwaffe, for its part, begins to learn a harder truth of its own, that mocked does not mean harmless, and that a big American fighter that can take cannon shells and still return can also keep coming back tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, escorting bombers deeper, hammering airfields, forcing German fighters to climb and fight on Allied terms. As the months roll forward into 1944 and 1945, the P-47's reputation completes its transformation. When longer-range escorts take over the deepest penetration work, Thunderbolts become the brutal workhorses of the tactical air war. Fighter bombers diving through flak to tear up rail lines, supply columns, bridges, and airfields, returning with flaps shot through, cylinders scarred, wings patched and repatched, because the aircraft can absorb ground fire the way it absorbed Johnson's nightmare in 1943. German soldiers on roads and dispersal fields begin to fear the sound of a radial engine coming in low, because the jug doesn't have to be graceful to be lethal. It only has to arrive and keep firing. And in the middle of that larger arc, Johnson's battered Thunderbolt sits as a kind of grim exhibit for everyone who needs convincing: ground crewmen, new pilots, even visiting brass, an airplane that makes the war's logic visible. The P-47 may look too fat, but fat can mean armor, and mass can mean structure, and structure can mean you live long enough to bring your guns to bear again. The jokes die the way all bad jokes die in combat, quietly, replaced by respect, because somewhere over France, a German pilot emptied his weapons into a Thunderbolt and watched it keep flying, and once you've seen that, you don't laugh at it anymore. You plan around it. 2 days after Johnson's battered Thunderbolt becomes the talk of the hardstand, the 56th is back under the low ceiling of an English morning, boots scuffing on wet concrete as pilots file into a briefing hut at RAF Halesworth, and then Debden, 8 Fighter Command's world of cigarette smoke, grease pencils, and maps pinned to boards, where Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke stands with a pointer and the kind of calm that makes men listen. Because he isn't selling romance, he's selling survival. The P-47, he tells them, is not going to win by trying to outturn a Focke-Wulf, and the Luftwaffe's laughter only matters if you start believing it. So instead, they will make the enemy fight the jug where it's strongest. High altitude, speed, diving attack, and disciplined teamwork. And then he draws a shape on the map. Not a tight, close escort cluster around the bombers, but a spread, a deliberate arc that will let his squadrons catch German fighters before they can line up easy shots on a B-17's wounded tail. Later men will call it the Zemke fan, but on the morning you're about to fly it, it feels less like a clever theory and more like a gamble made with human lives, because it means you're trusting separation and radio discipline in a sky where a single mistake can leave you alone like Johnson was. The mission kicks off with that familiar tightening in the chest as Thunderbolts rumble down the runway one by one, heavy on takeoff, climbing slowly at first, then steadier as the big R2800 and the turbo supercharger settle into their song. And soon the formation is above the cloud layer where sunlight is cruelly bright and the world below looks calm enough to fool you. Up ahead, the bomber stream glitters. B-17 and B-24s dragging contrails toward the continent. And the escort job begins the way it always does, with boredom that tastes like dread, eyes scanning empty sky while you imagine the enemy already climbing, already choosing where to strike. When Zemke gives the signal, the group opens out in that wide arc, flights fanning like fingers across a horizon, and for a moment it feels wrong to be away from the bombers, wrong to leave them with so much sky between. But then the first contacts appear, dark specks that become FW-190s and BF-109s as they dive. And suddenly the geometry makes sense, because now the attackers don't meet one tight knot of escorts they can dodge. They meet multiple threats converging from different angles, P-47s diving like dropped hammers, compressibility shuddering through the airframe as speed builds, 8.50 caliber guns stitching the air with blunt, murderous lines. The jug is still fat up close, but in a dive it becomes something else entirely. Fast enough that German pilots who expected to dictate the fight find themselves reacting, pulling hard, trying to shake a heavy American fighter that doesn't need to turn with them because it can simply slash through, fire, then climb back up into altitude like a prizefighter backing out of range. In one of those early engagements, 12th of May 1943, the first full test of Zemke's new method, radio calls overlap and snap, wingmen strain to keep visual contact, and the Luftwaffe throws experienced men into the brawl, including aces who have lived in the air since 1940. The fight becomes a series of brief, violent windows, an FW-190 crossing your nose, a flick of lead, a burst, a snap roll down through cloud. And amid the chaos, Zemke himself gets into trouble. Outnumbered, and suddenly under attack by Major Gunther Rahl of JG-11, a name that carries weight even if you've never seen his face. Pilots shout warnings, someone dives to help, tracers crisscross, and the engagement ends with kills claimed and losses taken. Proof that the tactic can initiate contact, but also proof that nothing in fighter war is safe, not even when your machine is rugged and your doctrine is smart. Back at Debden, the debrief is a study in fatigue and adrenaline. Men talking over each other, intelligence officers trying to nail down times and places, pilots reenacting turns with their hands, and Zemke listening hard, already modifying the concept. Less spreading out individual flights, more spreading out squadrons, because the battlefield is the only instructor that never lies. And outside, ground crews are already patching and refueling, replacing panels riddled with holes, checking that self-sealing tanks did their job, wiping oil off cowlings and marking new scars on airframes that keep returning, because the P-47's durability is not a footnote anymore, it's part of the operating plan. If you can bring a pilot and a machine home, you can send them back tomorrow, and in a war of attrition that matters as much as any single dogfight. Through late 1943, the Luftwaffe's tone shifts in small ways that never make it into American victory speeches, but show up in how they fight. Fewer leisurely, confident passes. More attempts to attack from angles that avoid the Jug's dive. More caution when a Thunderbolt is above them with altitude to spend, because they have seen, over and over, that the big American fighter can soak up punishment and still keep its pilot alive. And they've learned something else too. A P-47 that survives is still dangerous even when it's damaged, because 8 Brownings don't require elegance to kill, only a fraction of a second of alignment. Johnson's story circulates not as legend, but as warning, passed from squadron to squadron like a grim fable that says, essentially, don't assume the Jug will fall just because you hit it. Then 1944 arrives and the air war changes shape again. Longer-range P-51 Mustangs begin to take over the deepest escort routes and kill total swing as the chessboard shifts. But the Thunderbolt doesn't fade. It reassigns itself to the kind of violence it was built to endure, becoming the aircraft that can go down into the flak and come back missing pieces, because its strength isn't only that it can fight at altitude, it's that it can survive the ugly, low-altitude war where ground fire chews metal and pilots need an airplane that can take a beating and still climb. And as you sit there in the cramped briefing room again, maps changing, targets moving deeper into France and Germany, you can feel the punchline of the old German joke dissolving into something colder. The P-47 wasn't too fat to matter. It was fat because it was built to live, built to keep coming. And in the kind of war the Allies are now committed to, that means the Thunderbolt isn't just a fighter. It's pressure, day after day, on airfields and rail lines and anything trying to feed the Reich's armies. A blunt weapon that the Luftwaffe can mock only until it sees the same hole-riddled shapes rolling back onto English runways, again and again, refusing to die. June 6, 1944, Normandy coast near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. The dawn is smeared grey and pink over the channel, and the horizon is crowded with ships, more ships than any man in a cockpit can count. While below, the beaches are already coughing smoke as artillery and machine guns stitch the surf. First Lieutenant Tom Harrow, a 9th Air Force P-47 pilot in a fighter group newly tasked with close air support, rides in at low altitude with his flight, engine roaring like a sawmill, drop tank jettisoned, the Jug's big radial nose filling the windscreen as if the airplane is leaning forward to punch. The briefing back in England was simple in the way only invasion briefings can be. Hit gun positions, hit road traffic, keep German armor from reaching the beaches, and do it in weather that makes navigation feel like guesswork. Harrow has seen the P-47 escort bombers at high altitude, has watched contrails and the clean geometry of fighter sweeps, but this is different. This is the hedgerow. War, where you can smell cordite rising from the ground, and where every farmhouse might hide a flak gun. Ahead, a controller's voice, calm, almost detached, feeds target marks and headings, and Harrow drops his Thunderbolt into a shallow dive that makes his stomach lift. Because the moment you point the Jug down, it becomes what it was always meant to be: speed, mass, and 8.50 caliber Brownings that feel less like weapons and more like industrial tools. The first run is on a road junction inland, where German trucks are trying to move under cover of trees. And when Harrow squeezes the trigger, the aircraft shudders as if it's angry, tracers walking through foliage and splintering wood, the line of fire ripping forward in a straight, merciless stitch. He pulls out hard, G-forces biting, and the Thunderbolt answers with that stubborn strength the Luftwaffe mocked, wide wings holding, big engine pulling. Yet even as he climbs, he hears the first flak bursts, black puffs that appear. Too close and too fast, the air around him suddenly alive with sharp cracks and flying fragments. The Germans have learned by now that they may not always stop the Jug, but they can always try to scare it. And fear is a weapon too, especially at 500 feet where there's no room to think. Harrow turns back for a second pass and sees the ugliness that makes ground attack pilots older than their years. Tracer streams rising like glowing needles, 20mm flak making quick, angry bursts, small arms fire flashing from hedgerows. The Thunderbolt takes hits that feel like someone throwing rocks at a steel drum. Thunk, thunk. Then a harsher bang that makes the whole airframe twitch. His left wingtip is suddenly vibrating, and the cockpit fills with the smell of hot oil for an instant, but the engine keeps running. The big R2800 refusing to cough even when something has punched through the cowling. Harrow's mouth goes dry as he glances at the gauges. Oil pressure still there, temperatures climbing, but manageable. And he realizes, with the same stunned clarity Johnson had over France a year earlier, that the aircraft is taking damage that would have killed a lighter fighter, and it's still giving him options. He lines up again, lower now, almost level with the tops of trees, and drops a pair of bombs, 500-pounders, watching them tumble end over end before they detonate in a flat, brutal flash that kicks dirt and smoke across the road. He pulls away, and the Thunderbolt's tail feels mushy for a moment. Control force is odd, as if something has been bent, but it responds, still honest enough to fly, and as he climbs to rejoin, he sees another P-47 in the flight, with a flap shredded like cloth and a chunk missing from its horizontal stabilizer, yet it's still holding formation, still alive. This is where the P-47's reputation is truly forged, not in the clean jewels at 30,000 feet, but in the dirty work where you fly into the enemy's breathing space and invite every rifleman and gun crew to take a shot at you. The Jug's armor plate, its rugged structure, its self-sealing tanks, and that big radial up front. An engine that can keep turning even when cylinders are scarred and lines are nicked, become more than engineering features. They become the reason pilots come back, and coming back is the currency of a tactical air force trying to maintain pressure day after day. By the afternoon, the sky over Normandy is a constant churn of aircraft and flak, and Harrow's flight is sent farther inland, toward bridges and rail lines and any movement that looks like it might feed German counterattacks. The Germans call them Jabbers, fighter bombers, and the word carries a special bitterness now, because the P-47 doesn't need to win a turning fight to break an army's rhythm. It only needs to arrive low, fast, and repeatedly, shredding trucks, cratering roads, forcing convoys to move at night, forcing fuel and ammunition to take longer to reach the front, and every delayed resupply is a battle quietly won. On the third sortie of the day, Harrow comes back across the channel with his canopy streaked and his left wing peppered, holes you can see daylight through, and when he lowers the gear and brings the Thunderbolt in, the landing feels almost gentle compared to the violence he's been flying through. On the hard stand, the crew chief starts his walk around and whistles softly, not in admiration exactly, but in that stunned mechanic's way of acknowledging an airplane that has absorbed punishment and stayed functional. A jagged tear near the wing root, a line of punctures across the belly, fragments embedded in the cowling. Harrow climbs down with his knees still buzzing from adrenaline and hears a groundman mutter the same phrase he's heard before. "How the hell did she get you home?" And he understands why the Luftwaffe's early mockery was such a dangerous mistake. Because the P-47's bulk wasn't wasted mass. It was survivability turned into operational tempo, the ability to keep skilled pilots alive long enough to become veterans, and to keep German roads, airfields, and supply lines under a constant, grinding threat. As summer stretches into autumn and the front pushes toward the Rhine, the Thunderbolt's war becomes an endless cycle of low-level strikes, bombs, strafing, later rockets, each run flown through flak that tries to tear the aircraft apart, and each return flight adding another layer of patched metal and hard-earned confidence, because the Jug doesn't have to be pretty to be effective, it only has to come back. Until one day, in the winter ahead, The weather drops, the roads freeze, and the pressure becomes so desperate that even the toughest airplane in the sky will be asked to do more than any machine should. December the 23rd, 1944, over the Ardennes near Bastogne. The sky is finally clearing after days of low cloud that trapped Allied aircraft on the ground, while German armor surged forward, and the first break in weather feels like a door opening into a room that's been suffocating. Captain Tom Harrow, older now, voice rougher, confidence sharpened by 100 low-level runs, pushes his P-47D up through a thin layer of cloud into pale winter sunlight, and immediately the cold bites in a different way than at altitude over France in 1943. This is cold, wrapped around desperation, because below him, American troops are surrounded, and every road and crossroads in the Ardennes has become a question of whether the Germans can be slowed long enough for the line to hold. The radio is busy with urgent voices, controllers, flight leaders, ground units pleading for air. Yet the mission briefing had been clear. Hit anything moving toward Bastogne, smash supply columns, break up troop concentrations. Because the Luftwaffe may still be dangerous in the air, but on this day, the more immediate enemy is steel on roads, half-tracks and trucks, and fuel bowser lines feeding the spearheads. Harrow's flight comes in low over snowy forests, where the trees look black and skeletal, and the contrast is brutal. White fields, dark pines, and sudden flashes of muzzle fire as German flak crews, experienced, angry, well-sighted, open up the moment they hear the radials roar. The P-47 dives anyway, because that's what it does, and the aircraft's mass turns gravity into speed, the nose steady, the gun sight settling on a road where vehicles are trying to move under camouflage nets. Harrow squeezes the trigger, and 8.50 hammers, tracers stitching down the column, sparks and smoke bursting from trucks as fuel ignites, men scattering like black dots against the snow. He pulls up hard and feels the jug shudder as flak bursts snap too close, a sharp concussion that hits the ribs. Then the sickening slap of impacts, pieces of metal biting into wing and fuselage. He glances at the panel, still good, then looks out and sees a ragged hole punched through the right wing, daylight streaming through, yet the P-47 holds its line as if offended by the attempt to stop it. The second pass is rockets, 5-inch HVARs mounted under the wings, a weapon that turns the jug from a strafing threat into a tank hunter, and Harrow lines up on a cluster of vehicles near a tree line, releases, and watches the rockets streak out like white spears, slamming into the roadside with flat, violent flashes that toss snow and earth high and leave burning wrecks in their wake. The recoil is psychological more than physical, a sense that you've thrown something heavy and final. And as he climbs, he sees his wingman's aircraft trailing smoke. Not the thick black of fire, but the thin grey of coolant or oil vapor. Yet the wingman stays with him, because Thunderbolt pilots have learned an ugly habit. Unless the engine is dying right now, you keep flying until you're back over friendly lines, because the jug can be hurt and still keep its pilot alive. Below, the Battle of the Bulge is a map of choking roads and frozen ditches, and the P-47's role is simple and relentless. Pressure, disruption, fear. Because every truck destroyed is a German unit that might not get fuel, every bridge cratered is a delay that ripples outward. American ground troops later will talk about the comfort of hearing jugs overhead, that heavy radial drone that means someone is finally hitting back. And the irony is that the airplane once mocked as too fat now feels like the perfect tool for this kind of fight. It can carry bombs and rockets, it can absorb small arms fire and light flak better than lighter fighters, and it can keep returning in weather that punishes men and machines alike. Harrow's third sortie of the day is the kind that shows how survivability becomes legend. He's rolling in on a crossroads when a hidden 20mm flak gun opens up from a barn line, the bursts sharp and rapid, and before he can jink, the cockpit fills with the smell of hot oil and something harsher, burnt rubber or scorched insulation. While the jug jerks violently, the canopy frames rattle, and the engine note wavers for a heartbeat that feels like death. then steadies again with an angry, determined roar. Warning lights flicker, oil pressure dropping but not gone, and Harrow's mouth goes dry as he realizes a shell has punched into the front of the aircraft, into the area that should be most vulnerable. If the engine seizes, he'll have seconds before he's a glider over enemy territory, but the R-2800 keeps turning, cylinders firing unevenly, yet still producing thrust, and he uses that stubborn power to claw altitude and limp west, keeping speed up, avoiding hard maneuvers, talking himself through the instruments like a man talking down panic. Over friendly lines, he finally exhales, and only then does he notice his hands are shaking inside his gloves. The radio is full of similar stories: jugs limping home on partial power, tail surfaces shot up, wings holed, control cables nicked, because this is what the aircraft's design buys you in late 1944. Margin. The Thunderbolt's bulk is not elegance, it's redundancy and structure. Armor around the pilot, self-sealing tanks that reduce the chance of an instant fireball, and a radial engine that can take frontal hits in a way liquid-cooled inline engines often can't, because it doesn't rely on a single vulnerable coolant system to stay alive. When Harrow lands at dusk, the ground crew's faces tell the story before he speaks. The cowling is shredded, the forward fuselage peppered, a flap torn, and the right wing looks like someone took a punch press to it. The crew chief runs a hand along the jagged edges, finds shrapnel embedded in the metal, and says nothing for a long moment because mechanics don't romanticize. They just imagine the forces involved. Harrow climbs down stiff-legged, hears the engine tick as it cools, and realizes he has just lived through the kind of day that turns airplanes into symbols. The Luftwaffe used to mock the P-47 as a fat target, but in the winter of 1944, in the Ardennes, fat means you can take a hit from a hidden gun and still bring your pilot back, and in an air war measured by experience, by pilots who survive long enough to become deadly, that matters more than any joke. And somewhere out on those frozen roads, German drivers and infantry who watched heavy American fighters rip their columns apart begin to understand the other half of the Thunderbolt story. It isn't only hard to kill, it's also brutally efficient at killing you, because it can linger in the battlefield longer, carry heavier ordnance, and keep returning in waves. The pressure becomes constant, the kind that forces movement at night and concealment by day, and that constant pressure, built on a machine that comes home full of holes, helps squeeze the German offensive until it breaks, leaving the Reich with fewer trucks, fewer tanks, less fuel, and one more reason to fear the ugly, stubborn American jug overhead. January 1st, 1945, dawn over Belgium. The air is knife-cold and perfectly clear, the kind of winter morning that makes every sound travel. And on a forward Allied airfield, a sleepy sentry hears it first. Not the familiar rumble of friendly radials warming up, but a sudden, fast snarl of engines low on the horizon. Too many, too coordinated. And then the world erupts as German fighters and fighter bombers come in at treetop height in a desperate surprise strike meant to smash Allied air power on the ground. Captain Tom Harrow is not in the cockpit this time. He's sprinting across frozen mud toward revetments as bullets snap and aircraft burn, watching the Luftwaffe throw what it has left into one furious gamble. And what hits him hardest isn't just the violence, it's the feeling beneath it. This is what a cornered force sounds like. When the raid breaks and the smoke rises, the response is immediate and merciless, because the Allies have something the Luftwaffe no longer does: depth and... Within hours, Thunderbolts are back in the air in angry, organized waves, hunting dispersal fields, road traffic, rail yards, anything that feeds the German front. And you can sense the change in tone among pilots. The bulge has taught them what happens when weather shields the enemy. So now, under clear skies, they fly as if they mean to make up for lost days. Harrow's jug is patched from December, new panels riveted over old wounds, yet it still carries bombs and rockets like a pack mule that doesn't feel the load. And as he crosses into Germany, the landscape below looks exhausted. Roads scarred, Towns darkened, columns moving with a kind of frantic caution, because by 1945 the Germans have learned to fear daytime movement the way prey fears open fields. In a low-level armed reconnaissance run near the Eiffel, Harrow sees trucks hugging tree lines, halting under bridges, scattering when they hear engines, and he rolls in with his flight, the P-47's weight turning into a steady dive. The guns barking, rockets leaving the rails in bright streaks, impacts kicking up dirt and snow in flat flashes, and every time he pulls out, he flies through a gauntlet of fire that feels personal. Rifles, machine guns, light flak. Yet the Thunderbolt structure keeps giving him the same brutal gift. Survivable mistakes, survivable hits, the chance to be scared and still make it home. On one pass, a burst from a 20mm position tears through his left aileron, the controls momentarily going slack, and he feels that cold shock of this is it. But the aircraft doesn't disintegrate, it doesn't fold, it simply becomes heavier and less precise, forcing him to fly smoother, to keep speed, to keep his hands gentle. And when he looks out, he sees fabric fluttering from a control surface like a flag, absurdly delicate against all that metal. A younger pilot in the flight, Second Lieutenant Eddie Klein, fresh enough that his voice still tightens on the radio, calls out that he's been hit, that his engine is rough, and Harrow answers the way veterans do, flat and immediate. Keep it running. Stay with us. Don't fight it. Because that's what the Jug teaches you. Don't panic, manage the machine. Trust the fact that it was built to take punishment and still fly. Later, back on the hard stand, mechanics will find Klein's cowling peppered and one-cylinder bank scarred, yet the big radial brought him home anyway, and Klein will stare at the holes with the same expression Johnson wore in 1943, the expression of a man who has just realized his airplane is not merely transportation, but protection. Across the lines, a German pilot, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss, JG-26, flying a late-war FW-190 variant out of a battered airstrip, watches from altitude as Jabos work the roads and fields like predators, and he understands something that Luftwaffe men didn't fully grasp early on when they laughed at the Thunderbolt's bulk. The Jug doesn't need to win a pretty duel to defeat you. It only needs to keep you reacting, keep you grounded, keep your fuel trucks burning and your trains broken and your dispersal fields cratered. And by 1945, the Reich is full of burned-out junctions and shattered locomotives that feel like proof. Weiss dives once, lining up on a P-47 pulling out of a strafing run, and he fires a short burst, seeing hits walk across the Americans' wing route, expecting the familiar reward of pieces flying off. But the Thunderbolt simply rolls away, steadying, climbing, and Weiss feels the old irritation twist into something like respect, because he knows what it means when a plane refuses to die. It means the pilot will be back, and experienced pilots are becoming rare on his side. The radio in his cockpit is full of warnings now: fuel low, flak positions destroyed, airfields threatened. And in that clutter you can hear the Luftwaffe's late war problem. Every interception costs something it can't replace, while the Allies can afford to keep pressure constant, and the P-47 is the perfect machine for constant pressure. In March 1945, the Rhine becomes the next line of dread, bridges contested, German units trying to retreat or reinforce under a sky that no longer belongs to them, and Harrow flies missions that feel like the war's final grind, bombing choke points, strafing river crossings, ripping up rail spurs, feeding the front, sometimes working with ground controllers who talk him onto targets in hurried, urgent phrases, because now Allied troops are advancing so fast the battlefield shifts by the hour. On one run near a river town, flak bursts, black and close, and a fragment punches through the Thunderbolt's belly, jolting Harrow's seat, and for a heartbeat he tastes metal and thinks of fire. But the self-sealing tanks do what they were designed to do. The armor keeps the worst out of the cockpit, and the airplane remains a machine that wants to keep flying even when the sky tries to tear it apart. When he returns, the crew chief doesn't marvel anymore. He's past marvel. He just shakes his head and starts patching, because by spring, 1945 hole-riddled Thunderbolts are not unusual. They're routine, the expected cost of doing business in the lowest, dirtiest air war. And that routine is the point. A weapon that endures becomes a weapon that repeats. And repetition is what breaks an enemy's logistics, his morale, his ability to concentrate force. Because every daylight move becomes a risk, and every airfield becomes a target. Harrow feels it in the way German ground fire becomes more desperate, less disciplined, as if the men below are shooting at the sound of inevitability, and he realizes the Thunderbolt story has moved far beyond the old insult, too fat, into a kind of operational nightmare for the enemy. A big, ugly fighter bomber that can survive your best shots, carry heavy ordnance, and still come back tomorrow, dragging the war's weight down onto roads and rails until there's nowhere left to hide. April 18th, 1945, near Nuremberg. The war has the stale smell of ending. Towns dark, roads choked with refugees and retreating columns, airfields cratered and half abandoned. Yet, in the cockpit of a P-47, the danger is still immediate and personal, because a machine gun round doesn't care that history is turning the page. Captain Tom Harrow lifts off into a spring sky that looks almost peaceful, the kind of blue that makes you angry because it belongs to a world without flak, and his Thunderbolt is patched so many times its skin looks like a quilt of riveted rectangles, paint scuffed away around fasteners, exhaust stains streaking the belly. He's flying one of the war's last kinds of missions, armed reconnaissance over collapsing German supply routes, because even now the enemy is trying to move fuel, ammunition, and men, and the Allies mean to make that movement as painful as possible. The flight drops low over farmland and broken rail spurs, and Harrow hears the familiar growl of the R-2800, steady and confident, the sound that has followed him from Normandy hedgerows to Ardennes snow to the Rhine. And for a moment he feels the strange intimacy that forms between a pilot and a specific airplane, the sense that this machine has kept a bargain with him. You fly me hard, I'll bring you back if I can. The target appears, a cluster of trucks and a light armored vehicle trying to slip along a tree-lined road. And Harrow rolls in, guns firing, rockets leaving the rails, smoke and dust bursting from impacts. Then the reply comes instantly, like an angry snap. Light flak from the edge of a village, 20mm bursts, cracking so close he can feel the concussion through the canopy. And the jug takes a hit that sounds wrong. Deep, structural, not a ping, but a thud, followed by a sudden yaw and a heavy drag. The cockpit fills with the smell of fuel for a heartbeat, and Harrow's mouth goes dry because he has smelled that before and watched other pilots turn into fireballs. But the smell fades, and he realizes the self-sealing tank has done its job again, swelling and sealing around the puncture like living tissue, buying him time. The control stick feels heavier, the aircraft sluggish, and a warning light flickers, oil pressure low, and the engine note begins to roughen as if someone has thrown sand into the cylinders. This is the moment that separates myth from engineering, because the legend of the Thunderbolt isn't that it never gets hurt. It's that it gives you a chance to survive being hurt. And Harrow uses that chance with the cold discipline learned over 100 sorties. He levels out, keeps speed up, avoids hard turns, sets course west, and speaks into the radio with the flat tone of a man who refuses panic. I'm hit. Engine rough. Heading home. His wingman slides close, watching for smoke, for fire, for the sudden pitch down that means seizure, and Harrow stares at the gauges, listening to the radial's uneven hammer as if he can will it to keep turning. Below, Germany slides by in muted spring colors. Green fields, broken bridges, burned-out vehicles. Yet in Harrow's mind, it's all reduced to distance to coast, distance to friendly lines, the math of survival that never quite leaves you until the war is truly over. Behind him, a German soldier at a flak position watches the big American fighter limp away trailing faint vapor and feels the same bitter frustration countless men have felt since 1943. You hit it, you know you hit it, and it still goes. That frustration is the real epitaph of the Luftwaffe's early mockery, because the joke about the fat Thunderbolt only worked when they believed bulk meant vulnerability, and by 1945 bulk has become the opposite. Bulk has become a kind of armor you can't laugh through. Harrow crosses the Rhine and then the front line, and the world changes in small ways. Less scattered tracer fire, fewer black puffs, more friendly radio chatter. And only then does his body allow a thin thread of relief, though the engine is still rough and the oil pressure needle still dipping. The English Channel is far behind him now, but he remembers Johnson's story anyway. Remembers how a P-47 once came home with a shattered canopy and hundreds of holes and still landed, and he uses that memory like a tool, a way to keep fear from taking the controls. When he finally sees his own airfield, it looks almost unreal. Runways intact, dispersal areas busy, ambulances and fuel trucks moving with purpose, and he begins the descent carefully, because landing a wounded Jug is still dangerous, still a moment where the ground can kill you after the sky failed. He lowers the gear, feels the familiar drag, and the Thunderbolt responds slowly, stubbornly, like an old workhorse, then settles onto the runway with a heavy, skidding grace, rolling out under a coughing engine that finally sounds ready to quit, only now that it has done its job. The moment the aircraft stops, ground crewmen run in, and the crew chief, older now too, hands scarred from years of work, takes one look at the cowling and whistles low, because a shell has ripped a jagged trench along the front. Oil streaks run back like dark tears, and there are fresh punctures across the wings that you could put 2 fingers through. Harrow climbs down stiffly, and for a second he just stands on the concrete, listening to the engine tick and ping as it cools, watching mechanics touch the holes and shake their heads, and he realizes this is how the Thunderbolt ended the war, in hundreds of small, unfilmed moments. Not in a single heroic duel, but in repeated returns, patched metal and living pilots, sorties flown until the enemy's roads and airfields became unusable. Somewhere in those same weeks, Luftwaffe pilots who once laughed at the Jug's size have either been killed, captured, or grounded by fuel shortages and shattered infrastructure, and the ones who remain no longer mock what they can't change. The fat fighter has become a symbol of something deeper than aesthetics, an American machine built to endure, built to keep pilots alive, built to keep pressure on an enemy until collapse. And as April turns into May and surrender becomes inevitable, Harrow walks away from the battered aircraft and finally feels the strangest sensation of all. The war is ending, and the Jug brought him home again, full of holes, exactly as it was built to do.